My name is Nora. I am 29 years old, and on Christmas night, my father locked me out of his house in the snow and would not let me back in for so much as a coat. I stood on the porch with my purse on my shoulder and nothing else. And through the gap in the door, my father, Thomas, said the thing he had been saying my whole life. "You cannot do anything on your own. Nora, you are desperate." Behind him, my brother August pulled the curtain shut in what used to be my room. The next morning, I drove to the bank to use an old card my grandfather Richard had left me years ago, just hoping for gas money and a cheap motel. The manager swiped it, looked at her screen, and went white. "Ma'am," she whispered, "please sit down. You need to see this." 48 hours later, my father was not the one giving orders anymore. Welcome back to my channel, where the daughter they locked out on Christmas night turns out to be the one holding everything they never knew they had. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location and time in the comments. Hit subscribe, and let me know if you have ever been called desperate by the very people leaning on you the hardest. Exactly at 8:30 that morning, the bank's computer screen displayed a number that forever changed my family's order. The screen glowed bright. The bank manager, a woman named Claire, handed me a thick stack of printed documents. Her hands were shaking slightly. Taking the papers, my own hands remained perfectly still. Tears are an inefficient response to a systemic failure. I felt no urge to pull out my phone and beg Thomas for a reprieve. Instead, I sat in the leather chair of the manager's office and processed the data in front of me. The documents detailed an irrevocable trust. It was a legally binding fortress, constructed in absolute secrecy by my grandfather, Richard, just months before he passed away. The numbers were clear, printed in crisp black ink. $85 million in liquid assets. But more importantly, 51% of the controlling shares of Richard Global Marine, our family's massive shipping empire. Thomas thought he was the undisputed king of the docks. He had spent the last 5 years parading around Seattle, acting as if he built the company from the ground up. He did not know that he was only managing a temporary illusion. Grandfather had transferred everything into this trust, setting a strict condition that it would remain sealed and managed by an independent board until my 29th birthday. That birthday was exactly 1 week ago. Tracing my finger over my grandfather's signature at the bottom of the page, I recognized the sharp and deliberate strokes of the man himself. He knew exactly what Thomas would do. He knew August would simply follow the path of least resistance. And he knew I would need time to grow, to understand the industry, and to develop the quiet strength necessary to handle the storm that was coming. The power in my hands was absolute. An irrevocable trust cannot be contested, altered, or dissolved by a bitter sun. I looked out the window of the bank. The Seattle sky was gray, a cold drizzle washing the streets. Yesterday, I was a young woman freezing on a porch, supposedly desperate and helpless. Today, I was the majority shareholder of a global shipping conglomerate. Folding the documents neatly, I placed them in my purse. The manager asked if I needed a glass of water. Declining politely, I thanked her for her time. Exiting the bank, my stride was calm and even. Confronting my father immediately served no strategic purpose. Let him enjoy his perceived victory a little longer. Let him think the cold had broken my spirit. True power does not need to announce its arrival with screams and threats. True power waits. It observes. It moves only when the trap is perfectly set. But the trust documents and the bank accounts were not the only things my grandfather had left for me. Tucked inside the thick leather folder was a small, sealed envelope. Inside it rested a single, heavy brass key. Stamped into the metal was the number 402. It led to a safety deposit box. The wealth was the shield, but this key was the sword. The brass key felt cold. I want to clear something up right away, because Thomas spent years telling a different version of my life. I was not living in his house because I had failed at building a career. I was there because 3 months before that Christmas, I had taken a mid-level job as a supply chain coordinator at the Seattle port terminals. Choosing a position that kept me on the ground was deliberate. It kept me away from the executive suites where my father and August spent their days drinking expensive coffee and pretending to be industry titans. Observing the actual operations was critical. I needed to see the cargo, the manifests, and the real flow of money. For months, I had been tracking discrepancies. Containers listed on our ledgers simply did not exist on the docks. Invoices for warehousing services were billed to offshore companies that had no physical footprint. Millions of dollars were slowly bleeding out of Richard Global Marine. Spending my nights using the economic analysis skills I had honed for years, I scrutinized the impact of recent international trade treaties, tracking how our capital was being secretly diverted under the guise of tariff mitigation. On Christmas Eve, I had finally gathered enough preliminary evidence. I made the mistake of thinking my father still had a shred of loyalty to our family's legacy. Going to his study, I laid out the printed spreadsheets and calmly explained that we were being routed through ghost ships. I thought he would be alarmed. Instead, his face turned a shade of crimson I had never seen before. He did not look at the numbers. He looked at me with pure, unadulterated venom. Grabbing my arm, he dragged me to the front door and threw me out into the snow. He told me I was delusional, that I knew nothing about running a real business, and that my presence was a toxic infection in his home. August stood by the stairs, smirking, doing exactly what he always did, absolutely nothing. They thought they had silenced a nuisance. They thought throwing me out into the freezing night would teach me a lesson about my place in the hierarchy. Blinded by their own arrogance, they failed to realize I already had the complete picture. The confrontation on the porch was not a sudden burst of anger. It was a calculated move to sever ties before I could dig deeper into the offshore accounts. Thomas needed me gone because I was getting too close to the rot he had created. Sitting in my car in the bank parking lot, the heater finally warmed my numb fingers. I pulled the brass key from my purse and ran my thumb over the engraved numbers. The war for Richard Global Marine did not begin when my father slammed the door in my face. The battle lines were drawn long before that night. Putting the car in gear, I drove toward the port. It started 15 years ago. Growing up in the shadow of Thomas meant learning how to become invisible, while August was paraded around as the golden heir, the boy who would one day inherit the oceans. I was treated as an inconvenient afterthought. The grand family portrait hanging in the main foyer of Thomas's estate perfectly summarized my existence. August stood front and center, his hand resting on our father's shoulder, while I was positioned slightly behind a large decorative vase. My face was half-shadowed, barely registering in the frame. I was the spare part, the quiet girl who preferred reading economic theory over attending society galas. But I was never truly invisible. My grandfather, Richard, saw everything. He was a man made of iron and salt water, a visionary who built a logistics empire from a single rusty freighter. While Thomas spent his weekends trying to impress local politicians, Grandfather would take me down to the docks. I remember the smell of diesel oil and cold salt water that clung to his heavy wool coat. He would point to the massive shipping containers, explaining how a single delay in customs could ripple across an entire hemisphere. I was 12 years old when he first handed me a thick binder of trade charts and asked me to explain the correlation between fuel prices and freight rates. Stumbling through the answer, I noticed he listened with absolute focus. He treated my young, unpolished thoughts as if they held immense value. He recognized my natural affinity for systems, structure, and numbers. Over the years, he quietly funded my specialized education in international trade economics. Paying for my advanced certifications, he urged me to study the complex architectures of global supply chains. He never once pushed August to do the same. A title can be handed down, Grandfather told me one afternoon, watching the massive cranes load cargo onto his ships. But competence has to be forged. Let your father play his games. You learn how the machine actually works. He was building a weapon in the dark, preparing me for a future he knew Thomas would try to destroy. My father and brother looked at me and saw a desperate, socially awkward woman who could not secure a high society marriage. They saw a failure. They never realized that my quietness was not submission. It was intense, calculating observation. 4 grueling years at the university taught me how to read the hidden stories inside financial ledgers. I learned how to track money across borders and through shell corporations. Grandfather had given me the exact tools I needed to dismantle a corrupt enterprise piece by piece. Thomas thought locking me out was his final victory. He thought I would crumble without his financial support. But I did not need his support, and I certainly did not need his approval. The rot was finally exposed. I did not go back to Thomas's house. Booking a quiet, inexpensive hotel room near the waterfront, I showered and put on a crisp, gray suit. By 10 in the morning, I was back at the shipping terminals, walking into the main operations office as if nothing had changed. The air inside the warehouse management center was thick with tension. Navigating the narrow corridor toward my cubicle, I heard shouting coming from the supervisor's office. It was Thomas's voice, harsh and demanding, echoing through the thin walls. Stopping quietly by the door, I listened. Inside was Zane, the senior warehouse manager. Zane was 62 years old, a man whose hands were permanently calloused from 30 years of loading and securing cargo for my grandfather. When I was a neglected teenager, wandering the docks while Thomas ignored me, Zane was the one who would silently hand me a warm sandwich and a thermos of hot tea. He was a pillar of decency in a company that was rapidly losing its soul. Now, that pillar was being brutally chopped down. Thomas stood over Zane's desk, slamming a thick stack of printed papers down. He was demanding that Zane sign a voluntary resignation and a formal confession, accepting full responsibility for a $2 million deficit in the regional inventory. "You sign this, Zane, or I call the police right now and have you escorted out for embezzlement." Thomas barked. Through the glass partition, I saw Zane's face. He looked exhausted, his shoulders slumped under the weight of an accusation he could not possibly fight. His hands trembled as he looked at the document. He knew he was innocent. The inventory had been diverted by Thomas's own offshore shell companies, the very same ghost ships I had tried to expose on Christmas Eve. But Thomas needed a scapegoat to offer the board of directors before the annual audit, and an aging warehouse manager without expensive legal representation was the perfect target. Zane was about to lose his pension, his reputation, and his freedom. Also, my father could cover his gambling debts and financial failures. Seeing Zane, a man who had shown me more genuine care than my own blood, trembling before my father's baseless cruelty, ignited a cold, steady fire inside my chest. This was not just about corporate mismanagement anymore. This was about the destruction of innocent lives. Watching Thomas storm out of the office, his chest puffed out in false triumph, I remained in the shadows. I waited until the hallway was clear, then stepped into Zane's office. He looked up, his eyes red and defeated. Offering empty sympathy was useless. Pouring him a cup of water, I set it on his desk and looked him directly in the eye. I promised him, with absolute certainty, that he would not take the fall for this. I promised to find the truth. It was on August's desk. To understand how a family empire rots from the inside, you have to understand the psychology of a scapegoat. My father, Thomas, was not a brilliant businessman. He was a gambler who played with corporate funds. Whenever he made a reckless investment that failed, his ego could not process the reality of his own incompetence. He needed someone else to blame. He needed a vessel to carry his sins so he could look in the mirror and still see a king. At home, that vessel was me. I was the difficult daughter, the ungrateful child, the reason our family lacked perfect harmony. At Richard Global Marine, that vessel was anyone who lacked the power to fight back. The normalization of this cruelty was the most terrifying part. August, my younger brother, had learned early on that the easiest way to survive our father's toxic orbit was to nod, agree, and occasionally push someone else into the line of fire. August and the other executives went along with the abuse because having a designated scapegoat kept them safe. If Zane took the fall for the missing $2 million, the board of directors would be satisfied, the annual audit would close smoothly, and August could go back to his long lunches and expensive cars. They had normalized the destruction of innocent people. It was just business to them. But they had grown sloppy. August was incredibly lazy, while Zane was being interrogated in the supervisor's office. I casually bypassed the empty reception desk and entered August's suite, closing the door quietly behind me. I approached his mahogany desk. August rarely bothered to shred sensitive documents. He usually just tossed them into his bottom drawer, assuming his title made him immune to scrutiny. Opening the drawer, beneath a stack of glossy automotive magazines, I found exactly what the data suggested. There were 3 manila folders containing printed email chains and routing slips. The slips authorized massive payouts for warehousing services to a logistics firm registered overseas. The firm had no physical address in Seattle. They were ghost invoices, signed and approved by August, under direct orders from Thomas. They were bleeding the company dry and framing Zane for the missing inventory to balance the books. Extracting my phone, I carefully photographed every single page. My hands did not shake. My heart did not race. A cold, absolute clarity settled over my mind. They thought they had designed the perfect crime by sacrificing a loyal, aging man who had given his entire life to my grandfather's company. They thought no one would look close enough to see the strings attached to the puppet. Placing the folders exactly as I had found them, I quietly left the office. Navigating back to my small cubicle, the digital evidence burned a hole in my pocket. Thomas had spent his entire life building a machine fueled by blame, intimidation, and cowardice. He thought it was unstoppable. But my father's blame machine was about to hit a steel gear. Confronting Thomas or August with the photographs immediately was a tactical error. Confrontation without absolute leverage is just a complaint. And I was not interested in complaining. I was interested in an execution. Spending the rest of Monday and all of Tuesday sitting in my low-level cubicle, I remained completely ignored by the senior staff. They saw a disgraced daughter clinging to a mediocre supply chain job. They did not see the majority shareholder mapping out their demise. Using my standard system access, the process of cross-referencing the ghost invoices from August's desk with the actual port schedules began. My grandfather had paid for my education in international trade economics, and every hour of that intense study was now paying off. Tracing the container identification numbers listed on the fake invoices revealed a glaring flaw. According to the International Maritime Database, those specific containers had been decommissioned 3 years ago in Singapore. They were phantom boxes. Richard Global Marine was paying millions of dollars in storage, transit, and customs fees for steel boxes that literally did not exist. The money was being routed through a shell company in Panama, and from there, it was quietly filtering into a private equity fund. 12 hours of relentless digging finally uncovered the ultimate beneficiary of that equity fund. It was Thomas. He had lost a fortune in a series of disastrous real estate ventures 2 years ago. Instead of admitting defeat and restructuring his wealth, he decided to cannibalize my grandfather's company to cover his tracks. He was stealing from the legacy Richard had built, and he was perfectly willing to send an innocent man to prison to hide his theft. Sitting in the glow of my dual monitors as the office emptied out around me, the janitorial staff vacuumed the hallways, ignoring the woman in the corner cubicle staring at spreadsheets. The silence of the building was my only companion. The urge to boast or share my findings was non-existent. There is a profound, almost dangerous peace that comes with knowing you hold the truth while your enemies are busy building a house of lies. Compiling every piece of evidence, every timestamp, every routing number, and every fraudulent signature into a master file on an encrypted flash drive. I built a prosecution file that no corporate lawyer would be able to dismantle. Thomas thought his status as CEO made him untouchable. He believed the rules of economics and law did not apply to him. Packing up my bag and turning off my monitors. The glow faded, leaving my reflection in the dark screen. I looked tired, but my eyes were sharp. The puzzle was complete. By 11 o'clock Tuesday night, I had assembled the entire picture. But Thomas was not standing still, waiting to die. Wednesday morning brought a suffocating tension to the warehouse floor. The air was thick with rumors. Before the lunch hour even arrived, Thomas made his move. He did not do it quietly. He wanted an audience. Marching out of the executive elevator, accompanied by the director of human resources and 2 intimidating corporate security guards, they walked straight to Zane's office. From my cubicle, the confrontation was entirely visible through the glass walls. Thomas handed Zane an official, watermarked termination notice. Even without audio, Thomas's aggressive, sharp syllables were clear. He was giving Zane an ultimatum: sign the confession, forfeit the pension, and accept a quiet dismissal, or face formal criminal charges for embezzlement by Friday morning. Zane sat in his chair, his face gray, looking down at his worn hands. The man who had spent 30 years building this port was being discarded like broken machinery. After delivering the threat, Thomas turned and walked away, projecting an aura of absolute triumph. August was waiting for him near the employee parking garage. Stepping outside to clear my head, our paths crossed near the exit doors. August leaned against his expensive sports car, spinning his keys around his finger. "You should really start packing up your desk, Nora," August said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Dad is cleaning house. The old dead weight is getting cut. Once Zane is gone, you are next. You have no protection here anymore." Stopping to observe my brother, I noted his expensive suit, paid for by stolen money. I looked at his smug smile, built on a foundation of cowardice. He truly believed he was a predator, completely unaware that he was standing on a trapdoor. "Zane is innocent, August," I stated, keeping my voice perfectly flat and quiet. "You know he is innocent." August laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. "Innocence does not matter in the real world. Nora, power matters. Dad has it, and you do not. Welcome to reality. You should have stayed out in the snow." Getting into his car, he sped away, the engine roaring through the concrete garage. Standing there, feeling the cold wind blowing off the harbor, I realized anger was no longer the dominant emotion. I felt a deep, overwhelming pity for him. He was a hollow vessel, mirroring our father's worst traits because he had no identity of his own. They were destroying lives purely to maintain a facade of success. Watching the red taillights of his car disappear around the corner, my thoughts returned to Zane, sitting in his office, believing his life was over. I thought about the decades of quiet cruelty my father had inflicted on anyone who stood in his way. That was the moment I knew tolerance could not save this family. Only steel justice could. On Thursday morning, the port operated without me. Calling the Human Resources Department, I calmly requested a personal day off, putting on a tailored navy blue suit and tying my hair back. I drove downtown. The sky was clear, the Seattle waterfront glittering under the pale winter sun, parking 2 blocks away from the central bank. I walked the rest of the way, acutely aware of the heavy brass key in my coat pocket. Entering the bank, the manager, Claire, recognized me immediately. A discreet, knowing nod was all it took before she escorted me past the main teller lines, down a quiet, carpeted hallway, and into the secure vault area. We passed rows of polished metal doors until we stopped at a specific section. "Box 402, Claire said quietly, inserting the bank's master key. I followed with my grandfather's brass key. We turned them simultaneously. The heavy metal door clicked open. Claire left me alone in a private viewing room with the long metal box. Sitting at the polished wooden table, a deep breath centered my focus. For a moment, my eyes rested on the closed lid. This was my grandfather's final move. He had orchestrated this entire sequence from his deathbed, trusting that I would be strong enough to see it through. I lifted the lid. Inside was a thick, leather-bound folder. Stamped on the front in gold lettering were the words, "Independent Financial Audit." Opening it revealed a masterpiece of forensic accounting. Grandfather had not been blind in his final years. He had hired an external, highly classified firm to conduct an offline audit of Thomas's activities. Every single shell company, every ghost invoice, every diverted fund was documented in agonizing detail. But the most critical piece was attached to the back of the audit, a handwritten letter from Richard, dated just 3 weeks before his heart failed. Nora. The letter read, "If you are reading this, Thomas has failed the final test. I knew he was stealing, but a father always hopes his son will eventually find his moral center. He will not. I have left you the majority shares because you possess the one thing he lacks: integrity. Use this audit. Do not hesitate. A surgeon cannot save the body without cutting out the infection. Protect the people who built this company. I am proud of you." Blinking away the slight sting in my eyes, I traced his handwriting, feeling a profound sense of closure. I was not alone, even from the grave. The only man who ever truly believed in me was guiding my hand. He had given me the weapon, but I had to be the one to pull the trigger. What I found in box 402 was not just documents. It was a ticking time bomb. Friday morning arrived with the heavy, electric atmosphere of an impending execution. Thomas had orchestrated a grand spectacle to mask his crimes. Calling a mandatory company-wide meeting to be held in the massive central warehouse at 10 o'clock was his way of ensuring maximum visibility. He wanted every dock worker, every administrative assistant, and every executive to witness the fall of Zane. It was a calculated move designed to strike fear into the workforce and project an image of a ruthless, uncompromising CEO cleaning up corporate corruption. Arriving at the warehouse, the space was already packed. Hundreds of employees stood in nervous silence. At the front of the room, Thomas had set up a small podium. August stood beside him, holding a pristine clipboard, playing the role of the diligent executive assistant. But the most sickening detail was positioned near the loading bay doors. Thomas had actually invited 2 local police officers. They stood with their arms crossed, waiting for a signal. He was really going to do it. He was going to have a 62-year-old man arrested in front of his peers, stripped of his dignity and his freedom, just to cover up a bad real estate gamble. Zane was seated on a folding chair near the front, isolated from the rest of the workers. He looked small, broken, staring blankly at the concrete floor. Refusing to sign the fake confession meant Thomas was following through on his threat. At exactly 10 o'clock, Thomas stepped up to the podium. Adjusting the microphone, the screech of feedback echoed through the cavernous warehouse. He looked out over the crowd, his chest expanded, his eyes gleaming with the intoxicating thrill of absolute authority. "Thank you all for being here," Thomas began, his voice booming over the speakers. "Richard Global Marine was built on trust and accountability. Unfortunately, when that trust is broken, leadership must make difficult, painful decisions. We have uncovered a massive discrepancy in our inventory, a theft that strikes at the very heart of this company." Pausing dramatically, he let the silence hang in the cold air before pointing a perfectly manicured finger directly at Zane. "Today, we are handing over the evidence of this betrayal to the authorities," Thomas announced. He looked at the police officers and gave them a solemn, theatrical nod. August smirked, clearly enjoying the show. Thomas felt invincible. He believed he was the master of the board, maneuvering his pawns with flawless precision. He thought his narrative was airtight, protected by his title and his sheer audacity. Reveling in the spotlight, he was completely blind to the shadows moving behind him. He did not know that the real audit had been completed long before he even opened his mouth. While Thomas was busy spending his Thursday afternoon planning a theatrical spectacle for the next morning, my time was spent in a quiet, wood-paneled office on the 42nd floor of a downtown high-rise. Across the mahogany table sat Elaine. She was a senior partner at one of the most ruthless corporate law firms in the Pacific Northwest. But more importantly, she was the executor of my grandfather's estate. She had been waiting for my call since the day Richard passed away. Placing the brass key on her desk alongside the encrypted flash drive containing my own digital findings, Elaine permitted herself a small, rare smile. She did not ask me if I was sure about this. She knew Richard, and she knew he would not have handed me the controlling shares if I lacked the spine to use them. For the next 3 hours, discussions of family loyalty or emotional betrayal were entirely absent. We spoke strictly in the cold, precise language of corporate governance, fiduciary duty, and emergency board resolutions. Elaine laid out the legal mechanism we were about to trigger. Thomas was currently operating as the Chief Executive Officer, a position granted by the Board of Directors after Richard's health declined. However, that board had been completely unaware of the irrevocable trust holding 51% of the voting shares. My grandfather had designed a silent shadow structure. Exercising my voting rights meant I could single-handedly force an emergency restructuring of the entire executive tier. Handing Elaine the printed copies of the ghost invoices I had pulled from August's desk, I detailed how Thomas was using offshore shell companies to drain our operating capital, and how he was actively framing Zane to take the fall. Elaine reviewed the documents with a steady, calculating gaze, noting every fraudulent signature, every mismatched shipping date, and every bypassed security protocol. Your father has violated several federal maritime commerce regulations, Elaine stated calmly, adjusting her glasses. But more immediately, he has violated his fiduciary duty to the shareholders, which means, as of this moment, he has violated his duty to you. Drafting the necessary paperwork became our sole focus. We prepared a formal notice of immediate suspension for the Chief Executive Officer. We drafted a secondary notice terminating August's employment for gross negligence and complicity in financial fraud. Yelling, threatening, or arguing was unnecessary. The law was a perfectly calibrated machine, and we were simply aligning the gears. Thomas thought he was a king ruling over an untouchable empire, completely blind to the fact that the actual owner of the castle was currently reviewing the eviction notices. Working late into the evening, every legal statute and every corporate bylaw was double-checked. There was no room for error, no space for a desperate counterattack. When the final documents were printed, signed, and stamped with the firm's official seal, I placed them carefully into my leather briefcase. With 24 hours left, I turned the final page. Before leaving the law firm that evening, Elaine handed over the heavy leather folder retrieved from safety deposit box 402. Having only read the handwritten letter from my grandfather and skimmed the executive summary at the bank, I finally opened the full offline audit in the quiet ambiance of Elaine's office. It was a staggering piece of forensic accounting. Richard had known everything. For the last 3 years of his life, while his physical heart was failing, his mind remained as sharp as shattered glass. Quietly hiring a team of shadow auditors, he tracked every single movement Thomas made. The folder contained original bank statements, wire transfer receipts, and even photographs of the empty offshore warehouses Thomas claimed we were leasing. Grandfather had compiled a flawless prosecution file against his own son. Tracing the pages, a profound wave of respect for the man who raised me washed over my thoughts. He could have fired Thomas before he died. He could have exposed the fraud publicly and saved the company the financial bleed. Instead, he chose to leave the weapon in a vault, waiting for me to find it. He wanted to see if I had the analytical skill to uncover the fraud on my own and the moral courage to execute the final judgment. It was a brutal, brilliant test of succession. He knew Thomas would eventually push too far. He knew my father would try to destroy an innocent person like Zane to save himself. Richard had set the stage, provided the ammunition, and stepped back into the shadows of history, trusting his quiet, overlooked granddaughter to protect the legacy he had built from nothing but saltwater and steel. If you are enjoying this story of a daughter discovering her hidden power and preparing to serve justice strictly by the book, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments if you have ever had to clean up a toxic mess left by someone who thought they were untouchable. Closing the heavy folder, the evidence felt absolute. There was no ambiguity, no gray area for Thomas to manipulate. He had built a house of cards on top of a concrete foundation, and I was currently holding this sledgehammer, thanking Elaine for her time. I walked out into the cool Seattle night. Anxiety about the next morning was non-existent. I felt a deep, resonant calm. On Friday morning, I put on my gray suit to understand why Thomas was about to lose everything in a matter of seconds. You have to understand the sheer, unyielding power of an irrevocable trust. It is a concept that arrogant people often fail to grasp because they confuse daily authority with actual ownership. Thomas walked around the port terminals wearing expensive suits, firing people, and signing contracts. Having the title of Chief Executive Officer and the corner office made him assume he was the supreme ruler of Richard Global Marine. But a CEO is merely an employee of the board, and the board answers to the shareholders. When my grandfather created the irrevocable trust, he legally removed 51% of the company's voting shares from his personal estate and placed them into a locked entity. The word irrevocable means exactly what it sounds like. It cannot be changed, canceled, or reversed without the explicit permission of the beneficiary. Once Richard signed those papers, the shares ceased to belong to him, and they certainly never belonged to Thomas. They belonged to the trust, waiting silently for my 29th birthday. In corporate governance, holding 51% of the voting shares is not just an advantage, it is absolute dictatorship. It means every other shareholder, including Thomas, who held a mere 15%, could vote against me in a board meeting, and their votes would simply bounce off my majority block. Electing or removing the entire board of directors was entirely within my legal scope. Rewriting the corporate bylaws was an option. Most importantly, I had the immediate, unilateral authority to fire the chief executive officer without severance or notice. Thomas was playing a game of office politics, relying on intimidation and loud threats to control the warehouse staff. Treating the company like a personal piggy bank worked only because he thought his bloodline protected him. He didn't realize that the legal architecture of a corporation does not care about your ego, your last name, or how loudly you can yell in a warehouse. It only cares about ink, signatures, and equity. Armed with the shadow audit and the trust documents, my position was impenetrable. Arguing with Thomas was pointless. Engaging in a screaming match in front of the employees would only diminish the impact. Presenting the documentation that legally erased his authority from existence was the only required action. True justice does not need to be loud, it just needs to be properly filed. Grabbing my heavy leather briefcase from the passenger seat, I finalized my approach. I walked toward the glass doors. By 10:15 on Friday morning, the main warehouse was dead silent. The initial murmurs of the gathered workforce had died away, replaced by a suffocating tension. Standing just outside the massive frosted glass doors that separated the administrative wing from the loading floor, Thomas's voice echoed through the public address system. He was putting on the performance of a lifetime. "We are a family here at Richard Global Marine," Thomas said, his voice dripping with fabricated sorrow. "And when a member of our family betrays us, it is a wound we all feel. $2 million of inventory does not just vanish into thin air. It was stolen by someone we trusted. someone who has been standing beside us for 30 years. Peering through a small gap in the frosted glass, I observed Thomas standing at the podium, gripping the edges like a seasoned politician. August stood 2 steps behind him, trying to look appropriately solemn but failing to hide a cruel smirk. And there was Zane, sitting on the folding chair, looking as if he had aged 10 years overnight. His eyes were fixed on the concrete floor. His hands trembled slightly as the 2 local police officers shifted their weight, waiting for Thomas to give the final signal to step forward with handcuffs. "Zane," Thomas boomed, pointing directly at the older man. "You have abused your position. You have stolen from the legacy of my father. We cannot let this infection spread. For the health of this company, we are cutting out the tumor today." It was a masterclass in projection. Every accusation Thomas hurled at Zane was a direct description of his own crimes. He was the infection. He was the one stealing from Richard's legacy, using a loyal, defenseless man as a human shield to protect his own greed was his final play. The sheer audacity of his lies would have made me sick if my preparation hadn't been so absolute. Glancing down at the heavy leather briefcase in my hand, I verified its contents one last time: the 51% share certificates, the termination notices, and the shadow audit. Thomas was standing at the peak of his perceived power, commanding a room of hundreds, feeling like the absolute master of his universe. He was seconds away from destroying Zane's life permanently. Taking a slow, deep breath, the cold air of the administrative hallway filled my lungs. Hesitation was absent. Fear was irrelevant. I placed my hand on the heavy metal handle of the warehouse doors. And then, the frosted glass doors swung open. The heavy doors clicked shut behind me, the sound echoing sharply across the silent warehouse. Every head in the cavernous room turned in my direction. Hundreds of dock workers, administrative staff, and managers stared in quiet confusion. The distance from the doors to the podium felt like crossing an active shipping lane. Every heel click echoed against the concrete, marking a steady, measured rhythm. The crowd's stares meant nothing. My focus locked entirely on the target ahead. Elaine, my grandfather's trust lawyer, walked half a step behind me, carrying her own sleek briefcase. Thomas stopped mid-sentence. His hand gripped the microphone, his expression twisting from arrogant triumph to deep, visceral annoyance. "Nora," Thomas barked over the speakers. "This is a mandatory employee meeting. You are not authorized to be on this floor. Security, escort her out." The 2 corporate security guards shifted uncomfortably, but did not move. Maintaining my pace, I walked straight up the 3 metal steps to the platform where Thomas and August stood, stopping directly in front of the podium. I placed my heavy leather briefcase on the wooden surface and clicked the golden latches open. "I am not here as an employee, Thomas," I stated quietly, though my voice carried easily through the tense air. "I am here as the majority owner of Richard Global Marine." August let out a loud, mocking laugh. "Have you lost your mind, Dad? Call the police over here. She's completely unhinged." Ignoring my brother was the most efficient response. Reaching into the briefcase, I pulled out the first stack of papers. The paper was thick, bound in dark blue legal covers. I placed it gently on the podium, right over Thomas's script. "Stack 1, I announced, my voice smooth and perfectly even. "The irrevocable trust established by Richard, transferring 51% of all voting shares and controlling interest directly to me upon my 29th birthday. Verified by Elaine here, the executor of the estate." Thomas stared at the blue cover. The annoyance in his eyes began to fracture, replaced by the very first, terrifying spark of comprehension. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Reaching into the briefcase, I pulled out the second, thicker folder and placed it next to the first. "Stack 2. The offline forensic audit commissioned by Grandfather 3 years ago, detailing exactly how you and August have been using offshore shell companies to route $2 million out of this warehouse to cover your personal debts." August stepped backward, his face instantly draining of color. Pulling out the final sheet of paper, stamped with the corporate seal, I laid it on top of the others. Stack 3. Your formal, immediate termination as Chief Executive Officer, signed by the majority shareholder. You have no authority here. You have no office here. Thomas turned pale in exactly 10 seconds. If you love seeing a bully's entire empire collapse through the quiet, absolute power of legal documentation, hit subscribe and share this video. The fallout is just beginning. The silence in the warehouse was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating quiet that follows a thunderclap, where the air itself feels bruised. Thomas stared at the 3 stacks of blue-bound documents resting on his podium. The color had completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a hollow, fragile shell of the tyrant he had been just 60 seconds prior. His eyes darted from the corporate seal to Elaine, my grandfather's lawyer, and finally to me. Reaching out with a trembling hand, his fingers hovered over the termination notice. He did not touch it. To touch it would make it real. "Nora," Thomas stammered, his voice stripped of all its previous booming authority. It was a weak, reedy sound. Let us take this upstairs, to my office. This is a family matter. We do not need to do this in front of the entire staff. We can negotiate." Observing him, I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no vindication, no sadness. Just a cold, sterile clarity. He was trying to play the family card, the exact same card he had gleefully shredded when he threw me out into the freezing snow on Christmas Eve. He wanted the privacy of an executive suite so he could manipulate, bargain, and twist the narrative. "I do not have an office upstairs yet," I replied, my voice steady and clear enough for the first 3 rows of warehouse workers to hear. "And you no longer have one at all. There is nothing left to negotiate. Thomas, you signed fraudulent invoices. You attempted to frame an innocent man for your own financial theft. The audit is complete, and your termination is effective immediately." August stepped forward, his face flushed with panic. "You cannot do this. Dad is the CEO. You are just a supply chain coordinator." "I was a coordinator," I corrected him, not raising my voice. "Now, I am the owner, and you are trespassing on my property." Thomas gripped the edges of the podium, his knuckles turning white. His chest heaved as panic finally set in. Looking out at the sea of faces, the hundreds of employees he had ruled with fear and intimidation offered him nothing. None of them looked away. None of them offered him an ounce of sympathy. They were watching a dictator being stripped of his crown by a woman he had relentlessly underestimated. Turning my attention to Zane, I noted the older man was still sitting on the folding chair, tears streaming silently down his weathered cheeks. The heavy burden of a false conviction had been lifted from his shoulders. Giving him a small, respectful nod confirmed his safety. The innocent were finally protected. Thomas realized there was no escape. The police officers, sensing the dramatic shift in legal authority, wisely took a step back toward the exit. "You locked the door on a snowy night. Thomas," I said quietly, leaning just an inch closer to the podium. "Today, I am locking the door to your empire." Have you ever watched someone who abused their power suddenly realize they have absolutely none left? Let me know in the comments how you handled that moment. Thomas stumbled backward, descending the metal stairs with heavy, uncoordinated steps. He walked out of the warehouse, a broken man retreating into the morning fog. But a cornered beast bites back hardest. The weekend passed in a blur of transition. By Monday morning, I was sitting behind the massive oak desk in the main executive suite. The room still smelled faintly of Thomas's expensive cologne, a lingering ghost I intended to air out. Elaine sat on the leather sofa, reviewing the immediate operational shifts. The port was running smoothly. The employees, freed from the constant threat of Thomas's erratic temper, were working with a renewed sense of purpose. At precisely 9:15, The heavy wooden doors of my office swung open without a knock. Thomas marched in, but he was not alone. The fragile, defeated man from Friday had vanished, replaced by a desperate, aggressive, cornered animal. Flanking him were 3 men in tailored, dark gray suits holding thick leather briefcases. They were not local attorneys. They carried the unmistakable arrogance of high-priced corporate litigators from out of state. "You really thought it would be this easy," Thomas sneered, his confidence artificially inflated by the hourly rate of the men standing next to him. The lead attorney stepped forward, dropping a thick legal binder onto my desk. "Miss Grant, we are filing an emergency injunction in federal court this morning. We are contesting the validity of the irrevocable trust and demanding an immediate freeze on all corporate assets." Flinching was out of the question. Standing up would concede ground. I simply looked at the binder, then at the attorney. "On what grounds?" I asked calmly. "On the grounds of mental incapacity," the lawyer stated, his voice practiced and smooth. "We have reason to believe that your grandfather, Richard, was suffering from advanced dementia during the final months of his life. He was not of sound mind when he signed those trust documents. Thomas, as the direct next of kin, asserts that you exercised undue influence over a vulnerable, confused elderly man to steal this company. It was a classic, desperate legal maneuver. If they could cast a shadow of doubt over my grandfather's cognitive state, they could drag the succession into probate court for years. They would freeze the accounts, cripple my ability to run the port, and slowly bleed me dry with legal fees until I was forced to settle and give Thomas his power back." Thomas smiled, crossing his arms over his chest. He actually thought he had found a loophole. He thought his expensive lawyers could rewrite reality and paint Richard as a feeble, manipulated old man. It was an insult to the brilliant, sharp-minded titan who had built this empire. Looking at Thomas, panic was entirely absent from my mind. Instead, a profound sense of disappointment washed over me that he was still trying to play games he could not win. He was relying on the assumption that grandfather had been careless in his final days. He was relying on the hope that I was unprepared for a counterattack. Slowly opening the bottom drawer of the oak desk, I bypassed the standard office supplies and pulled out the very last folder from safety deposit box 402. I opened the final leather cover. "Mental incapacity." I repeated the words slowly, letting them hang in the quiet executive office. Looking up at the lead attorney, I maintained eye contact. "That is a very serious allegation to bring before a federal judge. I assume you have medical documentation to support this claim." The lawyer cleared his throat, adjusting his tie. "We have testimonies from several family acquaintances who noted his declining health. The court will mandate a full medical review." "That will not be necessary," I replied, my voice as cool as the harbor water. Opening the folder I had retrieved from the desk, I laid out the facts. My grandfather was many things, but he was never careless. He anticipated exactly this maneuver. "Thomas, he knew your ego would never accept defeat without a fight." Sliding a thick, bound document across the polished oak desk toward the lawyers, I watched the lead attorney pick it up. His practiced, confident expression began to crack almost immediately as his eyes scanned the first page. "What you are holding is an independent, comprehensive neuropsychological evaluation," I explained, leaning back in my chair. "It was conducted 3 days before he signed the irrevocable trust. It is signed, notarized, and certified by 2 of the leading neurologists in the Pacific Northwest. They concluded, unequivocally, that Richard possessed complete, uncompromised cognitive clarity and executive function." Thomas's smug smile vanished. He looked at his lawyer, waiting for an objection, but the attorney was too busy reading the raised seals on the medical documents. "Furthermore," I continued, reaching into the folder one last time, "he left this." Pulling out a small, encrypted USB drive, I placed it next to the medical report. "This is a continuous, unedited video recording of the entire signing ceremony. In it, Richard clearly and eloquently explains exactly why he is transferring 51% of the shares to me, and why he is deliberately bypassing you due to your gross financial negligence. The silence in the room was absolute. The lawyers looked at the medical report, then at the USB drive, and finally at Thomas. They were expensive litigators, which meant they were also incredibly smart. They knew the difference between a viable legal challenge and professional suicide. Filing an injunction based on mental incapacity when an ironclad medical certification and video evidence existed was not just a losing battle, it was a fast track to sanctions for frivolous litigation and potential fraud. The lead attorney closed the binder. Picking it up, he turned to Thomas and shook his head. "Mr. Grant, we cannot proceed with this filing. The trust is impenetrable. If we go to court with this, we will be heavily sanctioned, and you will lose entirely." "What?" Thomas gasped, stepping toward the lawyer. "You work for me. I am paying you to fight this." "Not anymore," the lawyer said coldly. Without another word, the three men turned and walked out of the office, leaving Thomas standing completely alone. His false counterattack had crumbled into dust in less than 5 minutes. He had absolutely nothing left. It was time to rebuild the ruins. 6 months later, the Seattle port looked the same from a distance. The massive steel cranes still lifted brightly colored shipping containers against the gray sky, and the deep, resonant horns of the cargo freighters still echoed across the water. But on the inside, the very soul of Richard Global Marine had been transformed. The toxic, suffocating atmosphere of fear that Thomas had cultivated for 5 years was entirely gone, replaced by the clean, sharp scent of transparency and hard work. Standing on the observation deck of the main terminal, holding a cup of hot black coffee, I watched the morning operations. The ghost ships were gone. The offshore shell companies had been dismantled. The missing funds carefully traced and legally reabsorbed into the company's operating capital. Thomas was a ghost in the city he used to rule. After the lawyers abandoned him, the international trade commissions finalized their investigations into his fraudulent invoices. He was hit with massive economic sanctions and fines that wiped out whatever personal wealth he had left. Avoiding prison only happened because I chose not to press criminal charges on behalf of the company, preferring to exile him to irrelevance rather than drag my grandfather's name through a public criminal trial. Thomas had lost his title, his social standing, and his access to the family fortune. He was completely cut off. August, stripped of his corporate credit cards and his unearned vice president title, had spent the first 3 months wandering in a state of confused shock. He had never had to survive without the protective shield of our father's corruption. But tearing down the old regime was only half the job. The true measure of power is what you build in its place. Looking down at the loading docks, I saw Zane walking along the pier, wearing a bright orange safety vest and a white hard hat with the word Director stenciled on the front. Promoting him to Director of Port Operations happened the day after Thomas was removed. But I did not stop there. Using a portion of the recovered funds and my own liquid assets, the Richard Pension Fund was established. It was a dedicated, untouchable financial trust designed specifically to protect the retirement savings and healthcare benefits of the dock workers and warehouse staff. The men and women who actually broke their backs to build this company would never again be used as disposable pawns to cover an executive's gambling debts. Grandfather had built an empire of steel and saltwater, and I had finally restored the integrity that held it all together. Taking a deep breath of the cold ocean air, a profound, quiet peace settled into my bones. I was no longer the girl hiding behind the vase in the family portrait. But rebuilding required one final conversation. That afternoon, my assistant buzzed the intercom to let me know I had a visitor. The heavy oak doors opened, and August walked into my office. He looked drastically different. The expensive, tailored suits were gone, replaced by plain jeans and a worn jacket. He looked tired, humbled, and completely lost. Without Thomas to tell him who to be, he was a blank slate. Standing awkwardly in front of the massive desk, he twisted his hands. "Nora," he started, his voice lacking its usual arrogant edge. I need a job. The accounts are frozen. I don't know how to do anything else. Studying my brother, writing him a small check, and sending him away forever would have been easy. It would have been the simplest way to clean my hands of the past. But grandfather had not just left me money, he had left me the responsibility of stewardship. "I am not giving you an executive title, August," I stated, my voice calm and measured. "And I am not giving you a corporate expense account, but I will give you an opportunity." Opening my drawer, I pulled out a yellow safety vest and a pair of standard-issue steel-toed boots, placing them on the desk. "You will report to Zane at the South Loading Dock tomorrow at 6 in the morning," I told him. "You will work as a Tier 1 logistics handler. You will load cargo, sweep the floors, and learn how this company actually functions from the concrete up. If you show up on time, keep your head down, and respect the men around you. I will authorize a modest living stipend. If you complain, or if you disrespect Zane for even a second, you are done. Forever." August looked at the boots. For a moment, his old pride seemed ready to flare up, leading to a dramatic exit. But the pride was gone. Reaching out, he picked up the boots and nodded slowly. 6 in the morning, he whispered. "I'll be there." As he walked out of the office, I turned my chair to look out the large window facing the harbor. The sun was breaking through the Seattle clouds, casting a golden light over the ships. My grandfather's final lesson was finally clear. He knew that throwing money at a broken family would only accelerate their ruin. Legacy isn't what you inherit, it's what you protect and rebuild with absolute integrity. I had lost my father, but I had saved the empire, protected the innocent, and finally found my own unshakable strength. If this story of finding your silent strength and rebuilding a broken legacy resonated with you, please like, share this video, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for listening. The door clicked shut,